Okay, so in this video, working with Dan, we uncovered that he had kind of the next evolution, right? So we've fully automated this whole identity governance scenario for B2B guest accounts in a way where the IT admins weren't overburdened with a bunch of manual steps. So, Dan, let's go through what you did to kind of take that to the next level. And this involves user deprovisioning because it's a problem I think everybody has, unfortunately. How do you deprovision users in an automated fashion, right? So let me bring your screen back out here. Let's kind of talk a little bit about what this next evolution brought forth with the customer you worked with.
Sure, sure. So the interesting thing about this is this pattern here, the whole idea of having a SharePoint site with different folders actually worked into the user deprovisioning aspect as well. And I'll walk through that works. So as a quick reminder, you have a singular SharePoint site, and then you have folders that are secured to Azure AD security groups below these. Yep. Now, the customer had this need. The customer needed a solution to preserve users' OneDrive that left an agency while allowing a manager 60 days access to the user's OneDrive. And so what we did is we leveraged the same security pattern, but we created a SharePoint site called User Archive. So it's the idea that there's a SharePoint site with User Archive, and then departed user number 1, departed user number 2 as folders. Okay. Each folder containing the user's OneDrive material was then secured to the manager for a period of time. And that's where the access packages come in.
Very cool.
Now, it's a bit of an eye chart here. So let me walk you through this. And I have numbers in here to try to guide you of the whole process. So as we move to the cloud, when we think about how we used to run PowerShell, there was a server and it had a scheduled task, and hopefully the password was somewhat encrypted, and the scheduled task would run and it would do work. Well, when we think about moving to the cloud, how do we do type of automation that was typically done on-prem in the cloud? And so what we leveraged was an Azure automation account with a PowerShell runbook running in hybrid mode. Now, this is really, really cool. So if you're not familiar with Azure automation accounts and runbooks, just think PowerShell SaaS.
Right.
But it has a very powerful feature. It has the ability to execute the code on an on-premise server.
Yeah.
Which means that I can launch the code in Azure and it runs on the on-premise server, which now gives me the ability to make changes on-prem. Because when we think about it today, most of us are still in hybrid, right? When you create an exchange online mailbox, you do it on-prem. New Dash Remote mailbox, new O365 mailbox. So how do you have the script launching in Azure affect on-premise objects? And that's with the hybrid runbook. So we schedule the runbook, and when I say runbook, just think PowerShell script. It goes down here and then makes changes and deprovisions the users down here. Well, the second thing that it does is it then comes up here and does work in the cloud. So as we all well know, if our Exchange admins, I do some things on-prem, and then I do some things in the cloud. The runbook allows me to effectively run PowerShell commands both on-prem and in the cloud at the same time. So what we do for the SharePoint site in set 3 is we create a folder in the user archive SharePoint site to hold the OneDrive's data. So we have a SharePoint site called user OneDrive, and I'm just going to say John is leaving the company. We create a folder called John. We then find John's OneDrive, and we grant permissions to the folder in the archive site for the Azure AD security group. So remember, a SharePoint site, a SharePoint folder, the folder is secured with an AAD security group. Now this is all running within a runbook here. The fourth step we do is we actually create the security group here. So the runbook creates the security group and then secures the SharePoint folder. Okay, but remember, we have timed access that we need to do here. So how do we have an automated way to control timed access to a resource? That goes back to the access packages. So just like we created the access package for external sharing, our runbook then adds a security group to the catalog. We add the SharePoint site to the catalog. We create the access package. We create the policy. In our previous example, that was the 15 days. We add the SharePoint site to the access package. We add the security group to the access package. And then we assign the access package to the supervisor.
Okay.
At the end of the day, what happens is the supervisor has access to a folder in SharePoint that contains all of the user's OneDrive data. And this allows the customer to recoup a license. And you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute here. How did the data get copied from the user's OneDrive into the SharePoint folder? And for that, we use a logic app. So we send a request to logic apps, of which then copies all of the content here from the user's OneDrive into the folder in the external sharing site. So as we all well know, is when we used to run when we run PowerShell scripts on-prem, we always have the challenge of how are we going to store the credentials, right? Because a lot of these are very, very privileged activities, right? Enabling users, disabling users, copying content. And so this is a little bit dated where we are in 2022, but in order to ensure that there was as little of service accounts, I leveraged the run as certificate in the automation account. So you can see here, pardon me, I'll zoom in a little bit, that I have an indication here that the run as certificate is used as my authentication. So whenever we're making changes to the cloud, I'm using the run as certificate to authenticate to Graph for entitlement management. And I'm using the run as certificate to actually call into the various PnP PowerShell commands for SharePoint Online.
Okay, I have a question. How do I get that run as certificate?
Good point. So if you're not familiar with the run as certificate, if we take a look here.
Okay, so I think we're inside an Azure automation account now. We've gone into the portal, right? It's in the Azure portal. It's not in the Azure Active Directory portal. That's where things get a little funky, but it's interesting how they work together. So now you're inside of one of your Azure automation accounts. Let's talk a little bit about the run as certificate.
Sure. So when we have an Azure automation account, we have the concept of different identities. We have the run as account, and then we have the managed identities. I'll talk about managed identities in a minute. That's where I'm moving towards. But these are the run as accounts here. And so a run as account allows the automation account to be a security principle. In other words, we can authenticate with this certificate as this automation account to do work. So we export the run as certificate down to, and we load it into the machine certificate store of where the hybrid worker is running. So where do I get the certificate? The certificate is made when we enable the run as account. We then export the certificate and we install that on the hybrid worker role on premise. Now, the reason we do that there is when we run a hybrid run book, it executes the code on that machine. So this means that the PowerShell script now has the certificate of which it can then authenticate with the certificate to the various Azure services that we're trying to connect to. For example, Graph for entitlement management. We can authenticate to Exchange Online with a certificate for our different work here. And
Do you
then
need to configure the permissions for that service principal, the security principal?
absolutely, yep.
Right.
So the Azure automation account is the service principal that we
Correct.
are authenticating to. Yep.
But it needs to be given the right permission. It's not dynamically accessing this, right?
Right.
That is exactly correct.
Cool.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Now, for futures, as managed identities become more mature, that's where I'm moving the whole solution to. So this solution was, I think I created it in 2020.
Okay.
And I'm moving all of these into managed identities. Currently, there are some scenarios where managed identities aren't supported yet, but as they become more supported, I'll be moving to that, thus eliminating the security.
And maybe we need to clarify what these scenarios are, right? So managed identities are only available on Azure, so you need to have an Azure VM to run it, correct? Or
exactly, yep.
Or you can onboard your machine using Azure Arc, and that will give you a mass identity. So under your desk at home, if you want to have a mass identity and avoid the run as service accounts, then you can actually Azure Arc onboard your device onto Azure, and will look and feel like an Azure VM, hence getting a mass identity out of the box. But everything else would require the fallback into the run as scenario.
Exactly. Yep.
Cool.
Yep. And I've got another slide here, and that we can take a look at to show you how the authentication works here. And I put some example code. So the run as certificate is in the automation account, which is then imported into the machine store. And then I've got some examples of how I'm authenticating to the different services here. So this is how I'm authenticating to Graph with MSAL token. And you'll notice I'm passing the certificate here. So this is how I'm doing my entitlement management. And then similarly in nature, these are some example PowerShell commands of where I'm connecting to Azure AD. You'll notice here that I'm using the run as certificate. I'm connecting to Exchange Online with the run as certificate, and I'm connecting to Patterns and Practices, SharePoint Online PowerShell with certificates here. And again, this eliminates the need for having the service account with a password, right? This is much more secure.
Sure.
And then you can hear I'm actually connecting to AZ account too. Now, at the time, you'll notice in my Logic app, I'm using Azure Key Vault as well. So when we submit the HTTP request from the automation account into the Logic app, at the time, I had to use a secret to say, look, does the HTTP request contain the secret? And so I stored the secret in the Azure automation accounts. Once the secret is confirmed in the HTTP request, I then get a certificate out of Azure Key Vault, of which then I'm sending the Graph commands to go ahead and copy the OneDrive content from the user's OneDrive into the folder in the user archive site. So the key thing to remember here is if you're not familiar with Azure Key Vault, very, very powerful, cool solution for storing certificates and then secrets here, right? And we think about the old days, we would try to encrypt this information in an on-premise. Right. And it's very straightforward to store it in Azure Key Vault.
Very cool. So I think, going through this full sort of end-to-end scenario, kind of version 2.0, or what you've added in, so it's a full end-to-end sort of life cycle. I think the next video, what we'll cover is we'll actually cover the full demo. And I think that's going to be a cool one for folks tuning in so they can see it sort of live, take the code, play around with it, add it, tweak it, whatever they need to do. And I think what we'll do too, Dan, is we'll link to your LinkedIn on the show notes. If somebody runs into any questions, they might reach out, right? They might not, but we'll do that just as a way that if somebody gets stuck or I have another question, did you think about this, et cetera, might be an interesting, kind of communication pattern with folks out there that, are watching this thinking, God, this will actually solve so many of our pain points in our environment. So
yeah. And to be honest, when I started this project, it was a lot of, I don't want to say reverse engineering, but I really had to do some digging. And I'd like to call out a couple of
sure
scenarios with this that I think that the listeners might find helpful. The first one is how do you grant access to a SharePoint site? This is the article that I followed to grant access to the SharePoint app only scenario here. So when we think about this, when we're authenticating to SharePoint and we're not using a user security principle, we're using an app security principle here. And this was very helpful to allow the Run As account to be able to grant access to the different SharePoint site. And it walks you through the different things that you have to do. Because when I don't have a user, I have an application or an app-only principle to align with the verbiage here. How do I grant access to the SharePoint folder? So this was very, very helpful here. We'll get this in the show notes for you. The one thing that you got to be a little bit careful on is if you'll notice this syntax here, it sure looks like you want to put in, that should be HTTPS and this should be SharePoint.mytenant. This highlighted here, and the documentation team did a great job. That is the proper syntax. So don't overthink that you need to correct that with your native, your SharePoint URL.
Interesting. Okay.
So that's a very important one. And then the second one is in this solution here, we do a lot of emailing. And so how do you get around not having to, open Relay and things like that? Well, I found this article, which is very helpful in Exchange Online. And this allows service principals to send emails in an authorized fashion. So these are very, very, you can see here, we're calling app IDs. And so if you want to be able to send an email and not have to worry about, using a user account and a password, this was very, very helpful in being able to send automated emails against Exchange Online in an authenticated fashion.
Very cool. I don't think I knew about that. Did you know about that, Christos?
No, I didn't. It's nice.
Yeah. So because again, what I was trying to do is, my goal in the design is I didn't want any usernames and passwords involved in this, right?
Makes sense. It's a possible vulnerability, right?
Exactly, and it's a little bit dangerous, right? Because when you think about people getting new jobs, so this thing's up and running, and people are using it operationally, and then 2 or 3 years down the road, it's like, well, we want to make a change, or how does this work? And then yet tribal knowledge is lost. And so, or the account expires and now the whole thing doesn't work and you're trying to figure out why they don't have access. Well, the password expired. And as we all well know, never change password is probably not a good idea.
Right. Well, and we just talked about that, I want to say in the last couple of episodes, right? You want to make sure that you don't have a password that's a forever password because that always bites you down the road, right?
Yep, exactly. And so again, in the solution here, I did have to use credentials and to get to on-premise Exchange here. And just to show you what that looks like up in the portal, Azure Automation Accounts has a very cool thing called credentials. So this is the automation account. The automation account contains runbooks. Just think PowerShell scripts. But you'll notice down here in our resources, we have things such as the certificates. Well, here's our old friend, the Run As certificates. We have things such as variables. Very, very handy. So I can define my different variables that I can call from my runbooks. I only have to define it once. But this,
I have a question. Can you add Key Vault references to your secrets there so you don't have to directly add them to your variables?
Yes, if I take a look at my variables here, yeah, you can see here that I have it unencrypted and things, but yes, that absolutely should be up in Key Vault as well. And we can see in my other diagram that I'm actually calling it. We've got to remember though that this is my dev environment here. But
that's fine. I'm just for completeness, when people see these, they are aware that there's a better way to store secrets.
Absolutely. And then credentials here. So you can see here that my on-premise service account, so yellow is the name of my on-premise AD. This is how I'm securely storing the credentials for my service account running on-prem. Because remember, we're running in a hybrid mode because I have to do commands such as set remote mailbox, set AD user, and then AAD connect syncs those changes up.
Very cool. Well, Dan, we definitely thank you for joining us.
Well,
like I said,
thanks for having me. Yeah, it's
the last video
fun.
will, yeah, the last video we'll record. We'll actually have the full end-to-end demo. So if you've got any questions, if you are liking what you've found thus far, definitely smash the subscribe button, Christos? Isn't that what we tell people? Smash it, like it, share it. Right? I don't know. I feel like I'm getting older. Like I don't know all of the right hip lingo anymore for YouTube. So that's where this will show up. Will be a nice little playlist, and you can use it, Dan, within your realm of customers. Maybe there's a way for them to find value, and then we'll have folks in the community banging away at this code as well. Trying to make it be something in their world, because I think this is a scenario that affects more customers than we probably even have any idea of. So this is a great one to get out there for those folks who are trying to figure out a way to sort of stitch it together and make it work.
Exactly. Yeah. And hopefully there's enough examples in here that some of the things that I really had to dig for, we can bubble them up. Because again, there's always room for improvement. So if you go, hey, Dan, you probably should be doing this way, please let me know. I mean, this is all about, sharing the knowledge and everyone getting better. So
yeah.